and welcome to All the Things. This is the show where we talk about all the things related to God, the Bible, and real life. I'm Krista Bontrager, also known as Theology Mom. And once again, we are joined remotely. Monique is still just tucked away in Elisa Childers' basement. How you doing, Monique?
I am doing well. Welcome, everyone, to All the Things, the show where we talk about all the things related to God, the Bible, and real life. Tonight and every night, helping us out on our show is Bob Bontrager, Bob the Button Pusher Bontrager, helping us behind the scenes. Thank you so much.
Yes, technology is pretty amazing that we can be in all these different locations and be able to do the show. And I want to let people know that we are live tonight. So if you are watching us during the live stream, you can jump on and let us know you're watching and ask questions of us and the guest as we go through the conversation. In fact, I always like to check out like who's watching us, who's checking in. And Elaine is there, and Alyssa and Susanna, Linda Davis are there. So everyone's jumping on. We are live. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, and a big thank you to Elaine Voss and Jennifer Beidel for being our moderators tonight. Our show is sponsored by Impact 360, Birmingham Theological Seminary, the Center for Biblical Unity, Family 210 Clothing, and Theology Mom. So check out all of those websites to find out more about supporting important ministries that are doing work to further the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and make sure that you share the show, like the show, interact with the show. The more that you interact with it, the more that it helps the bots send out the message, helps us overcome shadow banning because they often don't like what we have to say. So why don't you give us a quick update, Monique? What has been happening for you this week?
I'm just living with the Childers, you guys. I am like the niece that they didn't know they needed living with them. Okay. I have permanently moved in. I've unpacked, like I am here.
You have clothes in the
to stay.
closet.
I have clothes in the closet. The dog greets me in the morning. Like we are definitely intertwined. I have, gosh, I feel like I've made good progress.
So for those who didn't tune in last week, tell them what you're doing there in the Childers' basement.
I am in the Childers' basement. Aside from eating lovely baked goods, I am also here to get further along in my book writing process. So in LA, I'm at the office and there's a bunch of things that are happening. And so one of the things that wasn't happening was a lot of time for me to write the book. So Krista and I decided that it would be best if I actually did a writing retreat. And so I will be living with the Childers for 3 weeks, and it'll be 3 weeks in total. Just writing. I spend a solid 7 to 8 hours every day just writing, reading and writing, and just working on the content for our book to be able to turn that into our publishers. Super grateful for the time that I'm able to have here. Super grateful for the Childers and just the fact that they've opened their home to me, because I'm just here. And then I pop in, and then I'm.
So, do you ever like go out of the basement? You ever like go
I do. I do. And hang out with the kids and talk with Elisa's husband, play with the dog. I'm just adopted in. And so super grateful, but that's what I'm doing here and am really enjoying it.
Very good.
So, yeah. How have you been? I miss you.
Well, I miss seeing your face. Yeah, no, good. I'm doing all the things that you told me to do while you're away, like all the tasks that you left for me. I haven't screwed anything up yet. All the bills have been paid and everything's good. So
thank you. We appreciate it.
Try to do my best. Did the family meeting this week. So no, it's going good. And I am also working on my chapters, doing revisions and helping you, if get stuck or whatever, just jumping in like, okay, let's get unstuck. So just trying to crank it out. And it's it's great to be in it with you. So that's what I've been doing.
And I am grateful. All right, you ready to get started?
Yeah, well, we got a very special guest tonight.
Yes.
And I hopefully I don't embarrass her, but she we were talking a little bit before we went on the air here, and when you think about someone of Nancy Pearcey's caliber, I mean, really, she is just such a veteran on issues of philosophy. She's been around, and she's I call her the godmother of women apologists. She was really the pioneer before the rest of us in making a trail in these areas, and her voice is just so important. The things that she's researched over the decades, she's done such pioneering work on issues, and I think the topic that we're going to talk about tonight is no exception to that.
Okay, do you remember in 2020 when she tweeted about the Center for Biblical Unity?
Just about knocked me out.
Okay, so
like we had existed for 5 minutes, and she was tweeting about you. I was like, working in apologetics for 25 years. She probably doesn't know me from Adam. You just came on the scene and Nancy Pearcey's tweeting about you. How is this happening?
For people who don't know, who may be new, I had just moved home from South Africa in 2018 and was trying to figure out what life was going to be. And, we started the Center for Biblical Unity, but I came out of a progressive background. So that being said, I didn't know anything about C.S. Lewis. I didn't know anything about Francis Schaeffer, Nancy Pearcey. These were names that not even like, I've heard of them, but I'm not really sure who they are. I had never heard of like these like super important names. And so I so clearly remember that you were sitting in the chair in the living room and I was passing by and you were like, no way. Oh my goodness. Nancy Pearcey just tweeted about you. And I said, oh, that's cute. And I kept going upstairs.
And no, she was, I might as well have said some rando person just tweeted about you. Had no idea.
I had no idea. And so then people were like, because my name was tagged and things like that, people started to jump on the thread and all of that. And so many people came to our ministry because of Mrs. Pearcey's tweet about us and about the ministry and things like that. And I'm super grateful. So then I reached out to her and was just like, hey, thank you so much. And over like the course of time, we'll just, let her know I appreciate her. And so then here, little old me, people, little old me, I just sent like a little random note and was just like, hey, I appreciate you. Thank you. And then she was like, I'm writing a book. And I said, what? You're telling me the goods, the inner workings? And from there, I was able to actually read an advanced copy of the book. You guys. So we're going to talk all about toxic masculinity and just all the good things. And so I'm super excited.
Yeah, me too. And I think that, this is a topic we've been wanting to do for a long time on the show. It has just become so socially acceptable to express even open hostility toward men. I mean, we see this even in mainstream venues. And, there's a strong sentiment in our country that it's okay to just demean men and punish them almost for just being men. And so I'm really excited to talk to Mrs. Pearcey about these issues. So let's bring her on.
Let's do it.
All right. Hello.
Am I supposed to unmute now?
Yes.
Is this my cue?
Yes.
Hi.
Well, it's great to have you back. I'm so glad Monique is on this time so that we could do this conversation together. I think a great place to start, Nancy, is just what made you write this book? Like, what got this issue on your radar? What were you noticing that you said, I want to invest a lot of time into researching this issue?
Well, the trigger really was that I was researching some sociological studies of Christian men And I said, hey, nobody knows this stuff. It's all hidden away in the academic literature. And we need to know because there's been so many attacks on men. And as you know, the primary target is evangelical Christian men.
Yeah.
They're often seen as like exhibit A of men who are toxic, oppressive, patriarchal, and so on, because they believe in some sort of authority in the home or headship, to use a biblical term. And so they're often targeted as being particularly toxic. And it wasn't hard at all to find examples, to introduce that part of the book. Lots and lots of examples of people saying, both Christian and secular, saying that if you believe in any form of headship, if you believe in complementarianism, you will be abusive. It silences women. It oppresses women. It's so common. And the sociologists, there were some of them who said, well, wait a minute, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Is there any evidence for these charges? And so over the past several years, there have been sociologists who decided, well, let's do some studies. The largest one, and the one that I rely on the most, I have about a dozen different sociologists, but the one I rely on the most is Brad Wilcox, who's at the University of Virginia. He's considered like maybe the top marriage sociologist in the country. And he did a study in which he found that it's quite a large study. It fills a whole book. It's not just an academic paper. And what he found was that evangelical Christian men who attend church regularly, in other words, they're actually committed, they're actually living it out, test out as being the most loving to their wives. They spend the most time with their wives. Their wives repeat. They interview the wives separately, which is important. The women report feeling loved and appreciated at higher rates than other women. These men are more involved with their kids in terms of shared activities like sports or church youth group. They're more involved in discipline, like setting screen time, putting limits on bedtime, and so on. They also have the lowest rate of divorce of any group in America, and they have the lowest rate of domestic violence of any group in America. And not even Christians know this. I tell this to Christian audiences, and they kind of sit back and say, what? We have no idea that Christian men are testing out so well. And objective empirical research. In other words, Brad Wilcox is not even an evangelical himself. He's Catholic. So it's not like he has a dog in this fight. He just, with his own, objective research, found that evangelical Protestant, he makes a point, evangelical Protestant men test out as the most loving fathers, the most loving husbands, the lowest rates of divorce and domestic violence. In fact, let me give you a quote, because I have some notes here, and he was actually quoted in the New York Times. That tells you somewhat about how prominent he is, that he's, even though he's a conservative Catholic, he gets quoted in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and Slate and so on. Anyway, he was quoted in the New York Times, and he said this: "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Full 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. The happiest wives in America are religious conservatives with conservative gender values." Nobody expected this. And I'm surprised the New York Times was willing to print it, to be honest. So this is amazing. This was sort of the trigger for writing the book. I said, we need to get this out. We need to encourage Christian men that they are actually doing a really good job compared to, the average American man. So that was the trigger. Yeah.
That's so good. And I want to have Bob put the graphic up so people can start pre-ordering the book. And it's called The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. It's going to drop toward the end of June 27th. So now's the time to go pre-order. And by pre-ordering, you'll also be helping Nancy, get the word out about the book, because the way Amazon kind of rigs the system is that it bases the algorithms based on the pre-orders. So if you like this kind of content, pre-ordering is a great way to support and send a clear message to publishers. Hey, we like this kind of content. We want more research that explores these important questions that other people aren't looking at. So that's a very practical way for you to help in that way. And so, Nancy, I guess what strikes me about this is that the messages about Christian men in particular, even by what I'm going to call the Christian media, often gives us the impression that Christian men are kind of the worst. They're the most abusive. They're the most oppressive toward their wives. But that doesn't sound like the picture that the research actually brings forward.
Yeah, you really have to go digging in the sociological literature to find this. And that's one reason I said, I've got to bring this out so that people can, be encouraged. And most of us have heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture, right? What I've read, in fact, is that's one of the most common statistics that Christian leaders use. I think they're trying to motivate us or something with a negative message. Well, it turns out that there's an answer to that as well. The sociologists went back to the research and they separated out the men who attend church regularly, the ones who are really committed, over against nominal Christian men. In other words, people who on a survey like that would check the Baptist box, for example, but they actually don't go to church very often, if at all. The differences between these two groups is stunning. Nominal Christian men are less engaged with their children. They spend less time with them in shared activities or discipline. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They have the highest level of divorce, even higher than secular men. And the real stunner is they have the highest rate of domestic violence, even higher than secular men. So this is why our statistics get so skewed. If you combine those two groups, you're going to get a skewed statistic. Let me quote Brad Wilcox again. He's my go-to sociologist on this. He wrote about it in Christianity Today. And he wrote, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestants who attend church infrequently or not at all. So apparently, a lot of men, will hang around the fringes of the Christian world, just enough to pick up language like headship and submission, but not get the biblical meaning of those terms. And instead, they inject meaning from the secular world, meaning from secular concepts of masculinity, of entitlement and dominance and so on. And they end up actually testing out as worse than secular men. So this is the challenge that faces us as Christians, because these guys are out there identifying as Christians, and yet they're living like secular men, and even worse, because they use, they cherry pick verses from the Bible to support what they're doing. So the challenge to the church is, how do we keep encouraging the men who do attend church regularly? Oh, and by the way, this is another cool quote from Brad Wilcox. He says, secular academics should, give up their prejudices against Christian men. I thought that was a good way of putting it. Secular researchers, sociologists, psychologists have often said what you just said, Krista, that Christian men are the worst in terms of being overbearing and tyrannical patriarchs and so on. He says we need to give up those prejudices. It's just not true. Christian men who attend church regularly test out the best. But the statistics are skewed because there's roughly an equal number of nominal Christian men, and they test out as worse than secular men. So that's what we're up against.
Wow, that's so helpful. I was actually going to follow up with that question of, well, I continuously hear that, divorce rates in the church are the same as in the world. So thank you for that, because that really helped to answer a question on, well, if the Christians, those who are attending church and everything like that, are, faring out at higher rates than, those in the secular world, how are the statistics the same? But that makes a lot of sense. In looking at statistics, since that's kind of what we're talking about right now, was there any data, or is there any data that let you know that men are in crisis? Because when we're looking at the toxic war on masculinity, in reading the book, from what I remember, and I read it a while ago, but there wasn't a distinction between the toxic war on, white Christian men, or the toxic war on Christian men. It was the toxic war on masculinity overall. And so is there data that supports that that men are in crisis? What's that data?
Yeah, it wasn't hard at all to find, outrageous quotes. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Just blatant in the Washington
That's
Post.
pretty clear.
Why can't we hate men? A Huffington Post editor tweeted, my New Year's resolution is to kill all men. T-shirts, you can buy T-shirts that say so many men, so little ammunition.
Oh.
Books have appeared with titles like I Hate Men, No Good Men, Are Men Necessary? And to my surprise, I also found plenty of men denigrating their own sex. One book author says, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And you probably saw that when James Cameron, the director of the movie Avatar, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So certainly it's understandable that surveys are showing that men are starting to say, here's a recent survey, half of American men, about 46%, agree with the statement, these days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And actually, this was even more recent. This was on International Women's Day. There's a survey done in Britain. 55% of men, so more than half, said, quote, society has gone so far in promoting women's rights that it is now discriminating against men. So whether you agree or not, that is a lot of people who think men are now getting a bad deal, that the male bashing has gone too far. And I think that, Monique, your question is well taken, which is, well, but wait a minute. Men are actually doing worse today than they have in the past. Men are falling behind on all kinds of metrics, starting with school. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education, from kindergarten, through graduate school. In kindergarten, it starts in kindergarten because boys don't sit still and they're not as verbal. They don't have fine motor control as much as girls do. So, coloring and using the scissors, they don't do as well. And so they start falling behind even in kindergarten. They're falling behind all through elementary school, through high school. There are fewer men than women in college now. It's about 60-40, 60% women and 40% men in colleges now. And even graduate school, more women than men graduate from graduate school, and professional schools like law school and veterinary school. So, when women were falling behind, we poured a lot of money into developing curriculum and programs to encourage girls, and that's wonderful. And it's great that girls are moving ahead and they're benefiting from all that money and all those programs. But there's nothing comparable for boys, and so they're now falling behind. And if you say, well, we should do something for boys, shouldn't we? You immediately get pushback from a lot of people saying, well, men still end up in power, so why should we help them? They still end up as CEOs and presidents and Fortune 500 company, on the boards and so on, and filmmakers in Hollywood. But that's focusing on the maybe 10% of men who are at the very top. On the average, men are actually falling behind. They're actually more likely to be drug addicted, alcohol addicted, commit crime, be victims of crime, um, mental illness, and even life expectancy. Men are now, for the last 3 or 4 years now, men's life expectancy has gone down while women's has stayed the same. So we need to start asking what's happening to our men, and how we can, as a society, as a church, how can we start helping men recover the notion of dignity and purpose?
Yeah, we totally agree. I mean, they're saying in the chat, the saying, the future is female. We have a saying at the Center for Biblical Unity, the future is male and female. We will not have a future without strong men. And this is an important part of the conversation. So I think it's great to highlight this.
I actually, sorry, Krista,
Yeah,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, Mrs. Pearcey, what you're saying sounds so much like the conversations that we have just about race.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, when Black students fall behind, we create programs and things like that, and, cool, but we wouldn't create the same programs. Or if we talk about white students falling behind, well, they make up on the back end anyway, or they still manage to go farther ahead, or you know what I mean? And so it kind of reminded me of a conversation that we would have about race, but in relation to sex.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I even found out when I was writing the book, you guys might be surprised, I was, that this is the most controversial book I've written. You might think my last book would be, since it touches on things like the hookup culture and abortion and homosexuality, transgenderism. But actually, in the Christian world, this book has been more difficult because in my classrooms, most of my young female students are feminists who get very triggered if you say anything positive about men. If you say men are strong, they'll say, well, women are strong too. I was like, well, yeah, okay. Yes, they are. And then my male students get triggered on the other direction. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I had a very difficult time writing the first chapter because I had to disarm both sides. I had to rewrite the first chapter multiple times. Once they get into the content, most of the readers said, "Oh, this is really interesting. This stuff I didn't know." But I had to get them over that hurdle. I had to get them over the hurdle of, whose side are you on? That was the first question usually. Whose side are you on? Are you bashing men? Are you some feminist, raving feminist who's bashing men? Or are you some, reactionary conservative who's defending men? And I'm like, wait a minute. As Christians, we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it. We're supposed to be able to rise above these kinds of debates and look at it objectively. I had to plead with my readers, let's be objective, can we? Let's look at the facts. But it was very, very difficult. I had to rewrite the chapter and when people heard about it, for example, so one of my graduate students was a woman, and she told her husband that we were going through this book. I went through it with my students in manuscript form. And his first reaction was, well, whose side is she on? And the next was, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? I got those kind of responses all the time. So it has been it has turned out to be a very controversial book. And like I said, once people got into it, like the data I just told you about evangelical men, once they got into the actual content, they said, oh, this is great. This is interesting. This is stuff I didn't know. But my goodness, it was very difficult to figure out how to present it in a way that I could kind of get past all those barriers.
What you're saying really reminds me of what we covered on our show last week, talking about standpoint epistemology, or looking at what social location someone stands in that allows them the permission basically to be able to speak into a certain subject. So if you're not a man, can you speak on masculinity? You know what I mean? It's very interesting how objective truth gets put over here and almost like set to the side before we, until we ask, like, what are the qualifications? Is this person a man? Does this person understand this? What are their social locations? And then once we understand their social locations, then they have the opportunity to speak into a topic, instead of saying, is there objective truth that can be shared regardless of that person's social location?
Well, I overcome that by giving some of my own history. In my earlier book, Love Thy Body, I have some of my own stories, but my family wasn't ready for me to go public with them, as you might imagine. So I said, I'm not making that mistake again. I know that we live in the age of Oprah, where you get your credibility by having been there. And so I actually tell the opening story of how my father was severely abusive. He was very physically abusive. And, in books and therapy books, they ask open hand or closed fist. Well, it was closed fist. It was, okay, that's enough. So I tell that story, and people are again, this was a way of disarming people, because they could say, oh, you've been there. I could kind of say, I've been wrestling with what is a healthy masculinity since I was a little girl. My whole life, I've been trying to figure out what is a healthy, godly, biblical masculinity. I've had to go through a tremendous amount of emotional healing to get to this point. And I have found, Monique, maybe it shouldn't take that. We should care about truth for its own sake. But given the culture we're in, I have found that that's helped a lot. I had a professional writer who was one of my endorsers. And originally I had my story at the end, because, when I say that nominal men have the highest level of domestic violence, even higher than secular men, of course, I have to deal with that. Right? If I don't deal with that, it'll look like I'm trying to sweep it under the carpet. So I do end the book with 2 chapters on domestic violence and biblical answers to that. If you are married to or in contact with one of these nominal men, here's some biblical principles. And I originally had my story seemed to fit there, right? Mm-hmm. And then one of my expert reviewers said, he read it and he said, Nancy, this is pure gold. I don't really think of my story as pure gold, but that's how a writer looks at things like this. And he said, you got to put that at the front. So I did. I took his advice. I moved it to the front, because that does establish your credentials these days. So that does help, I think, with some audiences, to help say, I've been there. I've worked through this stuff on a very deep personal level.
Yeah, I want to go to a comment in the chat on YouTube that Jennifer was making. She says, my son went on a biblical manhood retreat where they said men often choose passivity or inaction because they think this way that they can't mess up. I'm so sad for our men, and we do need male leadership. And I guess that comment kind of leads me to a question of, do you have any thoughts about a biblical vision for masculinity? Because it seems like there's a few different competing ideas or competing streams, even among evangelicals, as to what the biblical teaching is on masculinity.
Yeah. Of course, when I say that nominal Christian men are really reading scripture through the lens of a secular worldview, then you have to say, well, what is that secular worldview? What is the secular script that our men are often picking up? And so a lot of the book does deal with where did the idea of toxic masculinity even come from? What historically have been the concepts of manhood? Because it started much earlier than most people realize. It starts with the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men are working with their family all day, right? Family farms, family industries. They're working alongside their wives. They're training their children day in and day out. And so men's role was conceived much more in terms of caretaking. The social expectation on men was much more that they were loving and nurturing And of course, they still had to have the traditional male characteristics. They were making their way in a wilderness, so they still had to resilience, mastery, courage, because there were always new fields to plow and new towns to build and new businesses to create. So, but the social expectation was that you didn't do that to get ahead individually. You did that for your family. You did that for your community. The common phrase back then was that men were expected to be fathers of the community. So how did we lose that? Well, it started with the Industrial Revolution. When work was taken out of the home and into factories and offices, of course, men had to follow their work. And for the first time, they were no longer working with people that they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working in competition with other men. Well, how do you think that affected the male script? Well, men began to feel like they had to be more assertive, more aggressive, look out for number one, make it. This is when the language started to change. You can see it in the literature today. People began to protest that men were becoming egocentric and greedy and acquisitive and self-promoting, and they didn't like it. They did not like the change that they were seeing in men. So you were starting to get this sort of negative description of men already early on in the Industrial Revolution. And there were other stages. In other words, it's hard to bring it all together. Let me see how I can make this shorter. There's also, as men began to work in the public arena, secularization also started happening, right? American culture became more secular. People began to say, well, the public realm should be value-free, right? Industry and factories and banks and academia. Well, value-free. In other words, people were being told, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we hear today. Right? That's when it started. Well, men were the ones who were working in the public realm and getting a secular education, working in a more and more secular workplace. And so men were losing their commitment to biblical morality. Men became secular earlier than women did because women were not out in the public realm, which was becoming value-free. And in fact, if anything, people didn't want to lose values. As they saw this public realm secularizing, they said, oh, wow, how are we going to protect values? People wanted to retain, religious devotion, love, altruism, self-sacrifice, relationship. Well, those were then relegated to the private realm, to the home and the church. And who would be in charge of them? Women, because women were the ones left at home. And so this is actually the first time in history that women were said to be morally and spiritually superior. Now we're kind of used to that. It's a double standard, right? We now kind of assume that women often are better, or more moral, or the ones who are supposed to hold the line in dating relationships. That the double standard. This is when it started. Never before in history had women been thought to be morally superior. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, the insight into right and wrong was seen as a rational insight, and men were thought to be more rational, and therefore men were more moral. And that is what gave them the right to have authority in society and in the home, because they were more moral. In fact, do you know what the Latin root of the word virtue is? Virtue. The Latin root is vir. Do you know what that means?
No.
It means man.
Oh.
Vir means man, like virile, like the word virile. Virtue comes from that same root. So virtue originally had connotations of manly strength and honor. So men were thought to be the virtuous ones. So it was really in the 19th century, America, that for the first time, women were said to be superior in terms, especially in areas like sex and alcohol. And women were seen to be the ones who were supposed to keep men in check. Women were supposed to hold men accountable. Men were supposed to be able to come home and be refined and reformed by their virtuous wives. Well, that was not good for relationships between the sexes, because men got tired of being painted as the villains. The 19th century was also the time when there were these great reform movements. because men's behavior was growing worse, and especially young men. Young men were coming into the cities, right, looking for work. So they were being separated from traditional structures of accountability, like their family, their church, their village. And so young men coming to the cities were much more prone to the vices there, like drinking, gambling, fighting, gangs, and sex. There was a huge increase of brothels, saloons, taverns, and so on. And that's why there was such a movement of reform, a huge increase of reform movements in the 19th century, because men's behavior was growing worse. I'll give you one fact to kind of hang this on. 1830, Americans drank more, 3 times as much as they do today. Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there was a reason there was a temperance movement and an abolition movement and what was called the social purity movement, which was against sex trafficking and prostitution. But the trouble was all these movements also tended to increase the tension between men and women because they all were condemnations of males. I mean, these were all traditionally male vices. Nobody had any doubt as who it was, what sex it was. It was the slaveholders, the tavern keepers, the clients at the brothels, the seducers, the drunkards. So these reform movements that just mushroomed in the 19th century all tended to have a very negative message toward men. So that's where a lot of the rhetoric that we have even today grew up. And, let me see if I can find one quote, because it's I had it earlier, and it's such a good. I don't want to take the time to find it.
No, go ahead. While you're looking for it, I'm gonna
Okay.
say this. One of the things that I loved about the book was just how educational it was and how it looked back at like things like the Industrial Revolution and quote unquote, what happened to the man, what happened in the family, where did the man go? And looking at the separation of the man from working in the home, working with his wife and kids, and work being a familial thing, to work being what's done outside of the home by the man, and women are now with the kids. Because at that time, before the Industrial Revolution, when men and women and kids worked together, it was mom and dad raising kids. There weren't these I'm not saying that there were no roles of distinction, but a lot of the roles were simultaneous. It was together. Though the husband and wife both worked and they both raised kids. And so what you see is that as men moved outside of the home, a lot of the movements that you're talking about were spearheaded by women. And I don't know. I just thought that highlighting that point and letting us know where a lot of this shift turned or that shift was made was super helpful. And it was so clear to be able to see, this is what it was before. And how when we don't protect something, when we don't, really keep the first things first, how we can lose both that first and the second thing.
Good. I did find the quote. So this was a quote by a historian, and he's paraphrasing Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So, but her quote is too long, so I'll give you the shorter quote. He says, "The early feminists contended that the affairs of government and business had been too long dominated by the crude, warlike, acquisitive, hard-headed, amoral qualities of men, and they should no longer be deprived of the tempering influence of women's compassion, spirituality, and moral sensitivity." So you see, the inflammatory language that we hear today is already back here in the 19th century in terms of its incredibly negative view of men and the public attacks on masculinity. It's important for us to know how long the roots are, how deeply they go back, because you can't deal with something if you think this started in the 60s. You're not going to deal with it effectively. You have to go all the way back and see where it started if you're going to be able to deal with it effectively.
I do agree. Krista, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating in all of the historical context. Kind of what comes to mind for me is my great grandparents, who were immigrants from Holland, and they came here as farmers. And, for them living out on the prairie, they were working together and doing everything together. And it's just natural for kids to want to follow their parents around, mimic what their parents are doing. And that was kind of how children were raised. It was very much a team effort. And I remember my grandmother telling me that all the time, when she was growing up on the prairie, her parents were very much in it together, in everything that they did. So it just really resonates with me, it's got my mind really going on, how some of the decisions we make today are how they have consequences for how we even are interacting with our kids. But I think for the biblical vision of masculinity, I think at minimum, it has to include, the idea of provision, which is something I heard you talk about, protection to some degree, being in the job of parenting together as a team. Like, these are some of the things that we see in scripture for what God calls men into, building things, cultivating something, building an aspect of culture. This is also part of what men do. If we don't have these things, if we don't have men that participate this way, it makes me wonder what the long-term consequence is going to be for civilization. I don't know. So
yeah, and I think this is part of general revelation too. There was an anthropologist who did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity a couple years ago. And what he found was all cultures hold in common certain views of masculinity, no matter what the differences are. And he called them the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, meaning have a family, raise a family. And he said, no matter how much they differed on other things, those 3 Ps are pretty universal in terms of what people in every culture expect of men. And there was another study that that was really eye-opening, and it was done by a sociologist who he found that men tend to have 2 conflicting scripts about what it means to be a man. This sociologist, again, has gone around the whole world asking young men the same 2 questions in countries all around the world. And he says, on the one hand, he'll ask the young men, what does it mean to be a good man? If there's a eulogy and people say he was a good man, what does that mean? Well, young men around the world know exactly what it means. It means honor, sacrifice, provision, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I like that one. Look out for the little guy. Be a protector, be responsible, be generous, and so on. And then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, well, what if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And they'd say, oh no, that's completely different. They would say, in fact, I'll read this one to you too. That's completely different. That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. In other words, most of the things we now call toxic the real man are the traits that today we tend to call toxic. And what he says is most men really are caught between these 2 scripts. We would say because they're made in God's image, they do know what the good man is. They do know the 3 Ps. But the culture that they're in presses them to be a real man, defined in traits that we think are not necessarily so healthy. Some of them, obviously, you want people to be able to hold together in a crisis. You want people to be strong in that sense, but you don't want them. That's a temporary strategy. You also want them to know how to be caring and nurturing. So I put that actually at the beginning of the book, because I found that too disarmed a lot of people, because they would say, are you attacking men or defending men? Neither one. We're defending the good man. Of course, we should. The good man is basically, God's image, and we're critiquing the real man. So, and that helped people to relax and say, okay, good. Okay, I'll go along with that. When you made that distinction, it would often disarm a lot of the criticism, a lot of the tension. People wondering, what, like I said earlier, whose side is she on? But we're on the side of the good man. So I agree with you. You don't even have to look that much at scripture, although I'm not denying the scripture, but general revelation, men know what the good man is, according to these studies. And these studies were not done by Christians, by the way. These are non-Christians, and they still found that men universally understand what the good man is.
I think that's very interesting, that men universally understand what the good man is, because you get much conversation jargon around this idea that the idea of being a male is just something that we make up. It's something
a social
that
construct.
It's a social construct. People, can pick and choose. There's nothing intrinsic to being a man or to being a woman. And yet your research finds that no, men generally know. You know what I mean? There's something about or at least some shared understanding of what it means to be a man.
Yeah, they understand that their male strength is not just designed to give them so they can get whatever they want. Mm-hmm. They understand that their unique male strengths are to provide, protect, and take care of, the people they love. And, I also start with biology in the book, because that's general. That's how God reveals his truth to us as well. God's word and God's world. And biology makes it pretty clear. Men are bigger and stronger because of testosterone. They're faster. They have more fast twitch muscles. Actually, I learned that term, fast twitch muscles. They can respond more quickly. And they do tend to be more aggressive and competitive. And that's good. I mean, obviously, God made them that way. Biology, is part of general revelation, where God tells us how he made us and how we should live. And women have their own strengths. I think the reason people don't like biology is because usually the emphasis is on male strength. But women have strengths too. Being able to bring forth life is a strength, and yes, being able to take care of children. You know how much work, what kind of character it takes to take care of an infant. You have to be extremely sensitive. You have to be able to pick up nonverbal cues. You have to be willing to be interrupted, no matter what time of day it is, no matter what you were doing. You have to be willing to be interrupted and take care of somebody else. There's incredible strength of character that goes into taking care of young children. So we need to be focusing on these strengths and calling them strengths, so that there's male strengths, but there's female strengths, and they are rooted in biology. Of course, that men and women's psychological traits overlap closely. We're more alike than we are different. If you have a bell curve, for psychological traits, they overlap pretty closely. So I don't want to overemphasize differences, but we should be grateful for those differences, because God has made us that way.
Yeah, and I love how you said that. Like, we can be grateful for the differences because God has made us this way. It doesn't steal anything away from me as a woman to acknowledge who you have been created and designed by God to be as a man.
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to go back to Jennifer's question about the passivity.
Yeah,
because I had something to say about that too. But sure, historically, that came a little later. So, as husbands and fathers left the home, the question is what happened to children, and what happened to boys, especially. For the first time, boys were not being raised day in and day out by their fathers. They had a lot of unsupervised time. What structure they did have was provided by women, mothers and female teachers. The leading psychologist of the day put it this way. He said, never in American history have our boys been so wild and so half orphaned. Isn't that an interesting term? Half orphaned, because their fathers weren't there. And so they were running wild. And what structure they did have was imposed by women. Well, boys didn't like that. They began to treat structure and rules and morality as things that were standards imposed by women, and therefore the real boy, would reject that structure, would rebel against it, and it became more common to say, "Oh, boys are just wild anyway," and boys will be boys. In fact, even the literature of the time shifted. Up until now, the literature for children was very didactic. It would show very good children, to give a model for children to be well behaved. Well, now for the first time, there was a new genre. It was actually called bad boy books, and where the protagonist was the misbehaving boy. And you can probably guess the best known of those. What were the best known of those? Mark Twain.
I was
Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah, okay.
At the end of Huckleberry Finn, he's going off. He's leaving his going off into the wilds because he says Aunt Sally is going to civilize me, and I can't stand it. So civilizing is something done by old maid aunts. So there became an ethos of boys need to recover their wildness. Boys are becoming too soft. They'd been raised by women. In fact, I don't know if you've heard this term, but it was very common at the time to worry about over-civilization. Our boys are becoming over-civilized. We need to help them to be tough and rough again. So I think Jennifer's comment comes from the over-civilization stage, where many boys, when they were no longer raised by their fathers and no longer had a day in and day out role model. I mean, girls suffered too. But girls at least had their mother there as a role model. Boys no longer had a daily role model of what it meant to be a man. And so the literature of the day began to be very concerned that boys were becoming soft and effeminate, and that they needed some toughening up. And I think maybe some of that has come into the Christian church too, that period of when boys were, when masculinity was almost seen as something negative, where boys were thought to be they were being raised to be more like girls.
Well, I would say that is the dominant view now. Now we're not even trying to civilize. I mean, we're not trying to work on toughening up boys. We're just expecting them to become kind of effeminate and to act like women. Like, we want our men to listen. Like, some of the advice I give to young married women friends is, don't expect your husband to act like your girlfriend. He's not going to listen the same. He'll listen, he'll care, but don't try to turn your husband into your girlfriend. Like, that's not how it's going to roll. But we kind of expect our men now, I think, to be sort of soft and passive, and that has become the vision for, my theory is that this is somewhat connected to reimagining Jesus as a kind of a soft man. And so we want to make our men kind of soft. I don't know. I could be wrong about that, but I don't know.
It might go back, we started with how boys are falling behind in school. There's a guy wrote a book on boys falling behind in school. And he said, here's how he put it. Girls are the gold standard and boys are seen as defective girls. And I thought that was a pretty good summary of how they're treated in school. And I think that may be where it's coming from, as even today, most boys are raised by women. They're raised by their mothers. They're raised by female teachers. When do they ever encounter a male teacher? Maybe in high school, maybe in youth group, but much of their growing up years are spent with women. And so that does cause a bit of an identity crisis, I think. And I agree with you that it's something that the church hasn't really addressed. Well, here's what we're doing, though. We're splitting. On the one hand, there's like you said, the Victorian Jesus, gentle and mild, meek and mild. And that was part of the Victorian age. but then we're getting the reaction against that, the Andrew Tate and the men who are almost going to the opposite extreme.
Mhm.
And I'm concerned about both. I'm concerned about the opposite extreme as well, because in the secular world, the opposite extreme is becoming well, it populates the manosphere. You're familiar with that term, the manosphere.
Yeah.
The manosphere, all of these men's rights groups and the MGTOW, men going their own way, men who are swearing off any relationship with women except maybe sex. And the red pill and the incels and the voluntary celibates and the involuntary celibates. And there's quite a active manosphere that is attracting men, including some Christian men. There are some Christian men's groups now, and I have a whole chapter on Darwinism and its impact on concepts of masculinity, because the idea that men should be wild and barbarian and recover their true their true self is really is this uncivilized beast within. A lot of that came from Darwinism, the idea that to try to find, and it was a reaction against Victorianism, of course. It was a reaction against the Jesus, meek and mild. But what it did is it taught many men that it almost reversed the idea of masculinity. Up until then, ever since the ancient Greeks, there was a notion that true character was that your moral will and your reason and your spirit, controls your animal appetites, your physical appetites. Well, this almost reversed it, because Darwin said, no, you are at core an animal. Right. You are at core, the beast within. The Tarzan books, for example, even after he's learned European customs, Tarzan says to Jane, this is a direct quote, "I am a wild beast at heart still." He still prefers to rip off his clothes and wear a loincloth and eat raw meat that he has killed himself. And a lot of men have picked up that strain of our culture as well, that somehow men need to get back in touch with that wild barbarian inner self. And that has also come from a very secular understanding of masculinity, largely influenced by Darwinism.
I think this is really interesting, because it's making me think how important it is for pastors and even youth pastors to create, a clear vision about being a Christian man and being a Christian woman. And that, because there are these competing visions in the culture, and some of them are somewhat compatible with biblical Christianity and others are not. And we need to create a better alternative and a biblically informed alternative. But I like what you said earlier about kind of the biblical vision for manhood. Susanna Turner on YouTube is asking the question, if men are more sensitive, artistic, and great communicators, has society caused men to question their sexuality, assuming they are gay, because they're not in the scripted idea of what a man is? And I think that that's a common rejoinder, but I think you kind of answer that in saying you're not saying that a good man is necessarily someone who goes out and kills his own food, but you are saying he does things like protect and provide and procreate. So if he's artistic or more sensitive, that doesn't make him effeminate. What makes him a good man is that he does these other things. Am I kind of hearing you right in that?
Yeah. Well, I did deal with that a lot in my earlier book, Love Thy Body, because it's the chapter on transgenderism in particular. Boys who might get caught up in the transgender movement obviously are going to be the more sensitive, sweet, gentle, relational. And so I really deal with that more in that book. But let me there's a cool summary by a historian. again, not a Christian. I love it the way these non-Christians sometimes see things so well. So his name is Peter Stearns, and he wrote a book called Be a Man. He's a historian, I think, at George Mason University. At any rate, he wrote a book and he said, a culture's concept of manhood is derived from its concept of God. So he says, take the polytheistic cultures, and like the ancient Greeks with their gods on Mount Olympus, or the Norse gods. He said, the polytheistic gods, here's how he puts it, they fought, they winched, they demanded military valor. And so polytheistic cultures tend to exalt the heroic virtues. The real man is a warrior. Well, there's some truth to that, but it's incomplete. And then he says, well, what about monotheistic cultures? Well, there's one kind of monotheism where God is completely transcendent and separate, which is most exemplified by Islam. I quote an Islamic scholar saying, in Islam, God is not seen, God would not condescend to have a relationship of love with mere mortals. That's a direct quote. That would be repugnant to God. So in Islam, it's a kind of monotheism that stresses pure power. So to be a man is to exercise power. Then he says, what about Judaism? Well, in Judaism, God does have a relationship with his people. He's in covenant relationship. Jeremiah, I will give them a heart to know me. So God does want to be known by his people. So in Judaism, God is a loving father. To be a man is to be a loving father. And then this historian says, when Christianity arose from within Judaism, it brought new complexity. He says, Jesus introduced the notion of servant leadership. He says, no other religion has the notion of servant leadership. And he quotes, Jesus saying, I came not to be served, but to serve. And he said, for the first time, things like gentleness and love and compassion became masculine virtues. And he said, Christianity praised men that had virtues that had previously been associated mostly with women. And so Christianity has this fullness. It can take all of these definitions. Every part of us, all of human nature is made in God's image. So in Christianity, we can have the fullness of all of these definitions, and men can have all the characteristics of God's own image. They don't have to choose. They can be whatever God has made them to be. And I think it has a much richer, fuller definition of masculinity.
Gosh, I think when you bring the biblical component into it, and the definition of masculinity and how full and rich it is when we take it from the scripture, you know what I mean? At our ministry at CFBU, we always say that the gospel offers a better hope, that Christianity has a better hope. And that's just what I hear you saying. It's like that Christianity truly does offer a better hope. And when we consider the conversation of masculinity, just relationship with men in general, and how we participate within our own sexes, Christianity does offer a better hope. As we wrap, we have two more questions that we'll have time to get to. The first question says, what about parents? What advice would you have for parents? My husband and I are raising two young boys. This is from Jessica Brown on Facebook. What advice would you give to parents who want to encourage their sons to embrace a godly masculinity in the midst of this culture, which is with so much confusion over gender issues?
Yeah, in a book like this, you have to have some answers, some practical solutions. So two things. One is I do have a chapter on history. Well, let me start by saying, obviously, the most important thing is fathers getting back in close relationship with their sons. Can we in any way recover some of the closeness that men had with their sons in the pre-industrial age? Can we work around at all the industrial, the work structure of our own day? And once again, let men be fully engaged with their kids. I quote one Christian psychologist who said, we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers. because it's fathers raising the next generation that's going to make the biggest difference in terms of creating a healthy masculinity. So first I do a little history again, because we all know that fathers are ridiculed and mocked in the media. They're always the doofus dad. And so I get a little bit like, okay, where did this come from? Why did we decide that we should, make fun of fathers? Again, it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Once fathers were out of the home all day, they did get out of touch with their family. They got out of touch with what was happening with their kids. They no longer knew what their kids were up to. They no longer knew what the rules were in the home, because the mothers were, enforcing the rules. They felt out of touch and irrelevant. And already in the 19th century, you get books saying, what's a father for anyway? They don't seem to do anything besides, bring home a paycheck. People began already denigrating fathers because they weren't home. And so they weren't in close contact with their families anymore. And so it's important for us to know that's where it came from. And then I do have a whole chapter on how can we make the workplace more flexible. And of course, a lot of this is anecdotal because is stories. There's no, single principle. It's lots of stories of people, fathers who found ways to be home more, to work 2 days a week from home, or to leave early. I have a father who leaves early 2 days a week to coach his son's basketball and soccer games. The pandemic brought a lot of fathers home. One of my graduate students was married to an IT professional who came home with the pandemic, and all of a sudden he's there to help with the homeschooling. All of a sudden he's there to help drive a kid to soccer. It's like he picked up so much of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to go back to doing more of her work. She's an opera singer. Wow. My student was an opera singer. She started a voice studio, and so the whole family is benefiting from her increased income. And they're and the time that he used to spend commuting, he now spends praying with his wife every morning. And they're like, we're never going back to a cubicle. The New York Times just had an article, by the way. I loved it. They said, fathers found that during the pandemic, they got closer to their kids and they don't want to lose it. That was in the New York Times. I loved it. Anyway, so I do have a chapter on, are there ways that we can bring more flexibility to the workplace? And the pandemic, the silver lining of the pandemic was more and more fathers. One study I found said 65% of fathers don't want to go back full time. They want to be home if they have children. They want to be able to be home more, work from home, have more flexible hours, so that they can keep that closeness with their kids that they gained.
To follow up to that, do you have any thoughts about like churches or, youth pastors, youth leaders, people who might be in relationship with kids who don't have fathers? Because I hear, a lot of the conversation is we need to get the fathers back in the home, but you also have kids who have no relationship with their fathers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I do talk about that in the book. I do say, fatherless kids should be a primary ministry of every church. I don't know if it's primary. I don't know if they see it that way right now. I think if you want to overcome toxic masculinity, you've got to raise the next generation with warm, loving, and morally directive relationship with men, father figures, substitute fathers. Oh yes, thanks for raising that, because otherwise, if you don't have the father in the home, you feel kind of, well, I'm left out then. No, the church really needs to step up and make this a major part of its ministry.
Well,
Preach,
historically,
Mrs. Pearcey, preach.
Yeah, because historically, Christians were known for orphan ministry. And to me, the modern day orphans are a lot of these kids who are growing up without a father in the home. They don't have close connection with their fathers. This is an area where I think there needs to be more conversation and more coaching and ministry guidance for youth pastors and on even the church as a whole, local churches as a whole, of how are we going to build a culture to bring up our men and our young boys into men, because one way or the other, our boys are going to be discipled. They're either going to be discipled by the culture and catechized by the culture, or they're going to be discipled by us. And so I think that having that conversation of what can we do in our local churches to build a culture of helping these boys grow into men, even if they don't have fathers in the home. This to me is right in line with the historic Christian tradition of orphan ministry, which is an actual biblical justice issue that's
Widows and orphans.
actually mentioned in the Bible.
Lots of verses on taking care of widows and orphans.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah.
Final question here. Seth on YouTube is asking, do you have any thoughts about toxic femininity? That, what is that and how does it impact sometimes good men?
Yeah. Well, I do start with those very, very toxic examples of attacks on men. But for space, I couldn't do everything. So,
Sure.
In the this is my book for men. This is my book for men. So I do address mostly men, and to be honest, the 2 chapters on domestic violence, I personally didn't realize how much domestic violence is primarily a problem among men. I mean, men are bigger and stronger. If they get into a fight, who's going to get hurt? It's going to be the woman. Did you know that 50% of murders of women, half of all women who are murdered by domestic partners? That's husbands, former husbands, boyfriends, former boyfriends. Half. So I did become a little bit more concerned about toxic masculinity when I got into those chapters, because I admit that to be balanced, I do give some examples of toxic women. I do. I give some examples of women who are verbally abusive, not generally physically abusive, because they're smaller and they're weaker, unless they have a weapon. One of my students said, "Well, I knew this girl who had a knife." Okay. If they have a weapon, but otherwise,
it wasn't me.
But the vast majority of domestic violence is perpetuated by men, and so more than I realized before I did the research on these chapters. So I that's what I focused on, because numerically speaking, statistically speaking, it is, as one Christian psychologist put it, it is primarily a male problem because it's 90% males who commit domestic violence. So I don't do a whole lot with toxic women. Maybe that's the next book.
But I also think that in looking at the book, you're addressing a lot of things that culture is calling toxic that actually might not be toxic according to a biblical standard. What is addressed in the book regarding women are things that, like, when I say, or if I would never say this, but to say, we should, get rid of all men. We can exterminate men. No, that's really toxic. That's a
toxic
problem.
femininity.
That is toxic femininity. But to say that, men working or men wanting to, having this intrinsic desire to lead, or to provide or to protect, that's toxic. I think those are two different things that are, being addressed. One is an innate, something that's innate within a man that I think culture is saying is toxic, which isn't toxic. Yeah. It's part of God's design for men. And then the other thing is something that is truly toxic that we should address as believers because of the Imago Dei and, men having design by God and things like that.
Yes. And that's why I start with the book. I mean, as soon as I get past the opening examples, I start with, let's affirm what's good about masculinity. Yes, men are bigger, stronger, more aggressive, more testosterone. These are good. It's very important to start with that. And even if later you say, well, the secular script for men tends to overdo dominance, entitlement, some of the more negative traits. That's the secular script. That's not the biblical script. And that's another thing I do very carefully in the book, as I really make a careful distinction between the biblical script and the secular script, so that I hope my readers always know which one I'm talking about. So I'm affirming biblical manhood, and I'm hoping that I help people to think more critically about the secular script. What's good about, like you said, some of it's intrinsic to men, and then some of it's secular. I mean, we live in a secular society. We should not be surprised that secularism has produced some negative definitions of manhood. Like I said, to reiterate, the impact of Darwinism, making men into the beast at heart, the barbarian. No, it has persuaded a lot of men. And here's where Christian men need to be critical thinkers too, because in their attempt to counter the power of feminism, feminism has had a tremendous amount of cultural power. It has. There's no doubt about it. And in order to counter that, some Christian men sort of reach over and grab parts of the secular script without really thinking critically about it. So that's where we need to keep the biblical script and the secular script separate.
That's super helpful. And once again, I want to let people know to go pre-order Nancy Pearcey's book. It's called The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, and it will drop at the end of June. So now's the time to order your copy. And again, this is a great help that notifies the publisher. It lets Amazon know that this is content that is important to us and that we value this kind of research. So make sure that you go get your order in now. Thank you so much, Nancy, for coming on and having this conversation with us. There's so much good feedback in the comments as to how helpful this has been to people. We really appreciate you going in, even though it's been a little controversial. I know it's been a bumpy road at times in doing the book. Thank you for persevering, because this is a very needed conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been really delightful. And I'm glad. I love it when we have questions from the audience and you find out what people are thinking. So I appreciate that.
Oh, very good. Thanks you so much
for being here.
Yes.
Thank you.
God bless you and your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Wow, that was an amazing conversation. We've been wanting to do for a very long time. Let's go to a quick break and hear from our friends at Birmingham Theological Seminary, and then our friends at Impact 360. We'll see you back in 2 minutes with some final thoughts.
The heart of BTS is first and foremost to be faithful. Faithful to the Word of God, to the sufficiency of Scripture, to knowing we serve a sovereign Lord. The second component of the heart of BTS is accessibility. We're affordable. We're flexible. We work with students to help them achieve goals. This isn't our journey. It's your journey for serving the Lord. It's your journey that God has called you to. So we pray that while God expands and grows the opportunities that we have, that we never lose sight to provide quality, Reformed theological education, faithfully and accessibly, so that we can serve the local church by building leaders for His kingdom.
I'd always heard in church, like, go and make disciples, and they'd always say that verse, and I'm like, I don't really know what that looks like at all. And then when I got here, they taught me like everything I was curious to know about, like progressive Christianity and how to talk to an atheist and how to go about witnessing to someone without it being overly preachy or insincere, and that helped me so much.
It's just been such an awesome week, going through these questions and really diving into them, and not just with me, but other Christians. It's not like an individual thing, it's a together thing. We're really strengthening our relationship with the Lord personally, but also together.
we have been given the greatest gift. We have been given life. And Propel has really made me realize once again how important it is to share that gift with the millions of people out there who don't have that gift that's just ripe for the taking.
Okay, once again, you can find out more by visiting our friends at Birmingham Theological Seminary. Go to bts.education and Impact 360. Now, I understand, Monique, that our friends at Impact 360, their gap year program is already full for
That's
23, 24. Crazy. Their 2-week summer camp already full, but they still have a few slots for the 1-week high school summer camp Propel. So that's what we've been telling people about, but don't sleep on it, because things are filling up. So,
and it's such important training, to get young people grounded in their worldview. You want to talk about, a way to war back against the culture and to be able to raise young men and women in the Word of God and in a worldview that they should be walking in. Well, Impact 360 would be a great option to be able to do that, to be able to speak into your child's life, to ground them so that as they grow, they are less susceptible to the culture's influences.
yeah. Well, walking away tonight from the show, I'm just wondering, what are some of your takeaways? I know you've read Nancy Pearcey's book. You're an endorser on the book. What are some things that maybe you went into that that you've changed your mind about, or some things that you've learned?
I don't know that I changed my mind about a lot. I learned a lot about the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
And how men were, taken out of the home for this unique role, something that hadn't been done before, because men generally worked in the home or at least if they had an outside shop, everybody worked at the outside shop together. And so just the importance of the family. It's important to have a father in the life of the child, and, not someone who comes home and interacts with the child for a couple hours and then now everybody's sleeping, things like that. But, how are you spending time on the weekends with your child? How are you having, those deep conversations that are impactful with your child? So the father just plays such an important role. And I think that's something that I really walked away with, is looking at the importance of the father. And then I also had to ask the question of, with all this male bashing, I'm like, I like men. Why am I still single, Krista? What's going on? Because I'm an advocate. I'm walking around like, y'all are my advocate. While the rest of the world is hating. What's going on? Help me. Okay. So that was going to be my question.
You can send Monique your suggestions for fixing her up.
No. You can send those to Kevin Briggins.
Oh yeah, send those to Kevin Briggins. He'll be
I'm going to have him
pre-screening
be my pre-screener. He knows. Right. He know. He's not here for the okie doke. And I know Kevin's on the stream, so I'm just.
Yeah.
What was your takeaway?
Definitely, like, my eyes were opened in thinking about the differences between Bible believing men, or more theologically conservative men, I don't know what you want to call them, genuine Christians, and those who are on like the periphery of Christian culture, nominal Christians, and secular men. That, Christian men who really have been regenerated and are truly Holy Spirit filled and trying to walk with the Lord, they just show up to life differently. I think that that's a powerful thing for me to be aware of, that I just didn't really have an awareness of before. And I'm so grateful in my own life, in growing up without a father, being able to be in 30 years of marriage with my husband, and seeing how he has been so diligent in good times and hard times in parenting our children with me and being in it with me. And it made me a little grateful tonight, that when my husband lost his job in 2009, that was rough, it was hard times. But I think, like Nancy said, the blessing of the pandemic for me, the blessing of that season was that my husband started a business that he was able to take my kids to all the time, and that they learned a good work ethic. They got to be with their dad on a regular basis, going to work with him in the business from a very young age. And it made me grateful for that. I hadn't really thought about that all the time that he spent with them as they worked side by side. And it was hard labor. It was hard physical labor. And you know what? That probably had more of an impact on my kids than I've recognized before. And just made me grateful for all of the journey with my husband, and seeing all that he's done and how he's stayed in it with us. And like I said, good times and bad. And maybe it just stands out to me from being a kid without a dad and seeing that. I don't know. That was kind of some of my takeaways.
Cool. Well, yes, we are all very grateful for Bob the Button Pusher Bontrager. All right.
So,
well, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so much for being with us tonight.
In 2 weeks.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing our Easter show in 2 weeks. We will be live, and we're going to be looking at the archaeology of Easter.
Yes, and I will actually be home.
Yes, God willing, Monique will be home by then, and we'll be talking about kind of the history and historical evidence surrounding Easter with Brian Wendell from Associates for Biblical Research. It's going to be a great conversation. Some of you may have caught our conversation about the archaeology of Christmas a few months ago. So we're going to do a similar discussion, but we're going to bring him on all the things so Monique can meet him. And I think it's going to be a great time. So we're going to see you in 2 weeks for the live show.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. You guys have a good night, and God bless.
There's nothing left.